my name is Sara. I'm the Director of Animal Collections at Butterfly Pavilion. I do a lot of work with the associations of zoos and aquariums around coral conservation and health. So my goal today for this talk is to teach you some of the methods that we utilize within zoos to help you with your home aquariums be better at diagnosing issues with your coral, be them pests or disease. So first and foremost, when we're looking at coral, what does a healthy coral look like? A lot of people think they know, but if you look at a coral that's actually out in the oceans, it looks vastly different from the coral that we have under our care. And those differences can be really striking in tissue condition, coloration of the animal, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one is healthier than the other. They're just very good at adapting to their environments. So when you're looking at coral, and particularly when you're diagnosing disease or issues within your animals, you really want to understand coral anatomy. You don't necessarily need to know all of the specific scientific names or things like that, but really just understanding that coral are a colonial animal. So each polyp is an individual animal within the coral colony. Within that polyp, you have a mouth, which will usually have feeding tentacles of some sort. You'll also have within the coral the septum or the skeleton of the coral, that calcium carbonate skeleton, specifically when you're looking at stony reef building corals. And those are the corals that I'm going to focus the most on. They tend to have a lot of various issues with disease, and they can be the trickiest to treat. They're also the coral that I have the most personal experience with. So when we're looking at coral disease, we're looking at the individual animal as a whole. I've gotten to the point with my corals where I can walk by a tank and something stops me because I know something's off with that coral. I don't always know what's off, I just know something's different in its behavior, in its coloration, in how it's presenting itself. And one of the biggest tricks or things that I hope you leave with today is when you're looking at the health of your animals, knowing what they look like when they're healthy, looking at them daily, understanding the differences in those individuals is your most critical tool in identifying when something's going wrong. So observing your animals, knowing what's best, what they look like at their best, is going to be so much more helpful than looking at a picture online of what that coral looks like best online. When we're looking at health, the things I focus on the most are going to be tissue. So the tissue of the coral, how is that looking, its coloration, how is it inflated, does it look sunken in, does it look really nice and thick? When I'm looking at the skeleton of the coral, does it look malformed, does it look very brittle, are there things that are picking at that skeleton, is it discolored in any way, is there algae that's encroaching? And then the color of the coral. Paling coral is a really quick, easy sign that something's not going quite right. It could be coral bleaching, which could be a reaction to something going on in your system, or it could be something deeper, such as disease. So here I have a picture, which is a little bit blurry up on the projector. This is an Acropora cervicornis. So this is an SPS, a small polyp stony coral. On this coral, you can see that the coloration is brown. That's very typical for this species. But you can also see if you look, I'm wondering if I could point them out. No. So up on the polyps, you'll see little kind of buds. Those are the feeding tentacles coming out. Seeing those on an SPS coral is a really good sign. It shows that that animal is having or able to have a feeding response, which is something that you see when an animal is really healthy. If you look at the different corallites, so the individual polyps themselves, that tissue looks rounded. It's really nice and thick. It's in really good health. So this is an example of a healthy SPS coral. They don't have as big inflated tissue as a lot of the LPS, so sometimes they can be the most difficult to identify if they're doing well or not. But this is what healthy looks like. This is a different example of an Acropora cervicornis. This coral pretty much looks dead, but there is actually tissue on it. It's just very sunken in tissue. The tissue is very thin. You can see the skeleton through it. It does not have a high presence of those zooxanthellae, those symbionts, so you can see the different patches that are paling. On the tips of the coral, you don't see growth. You can see the tissue starting to deteriorate, and you can't see any polyps whatsoever. So looking at them side by side, you can see the really stark difference in a healthy coral versus an unhealthy coral. And that's really important, is to understand what you're looking at when you're trying to do diagnosis of coral health. And it can be really difficult, and even in person it can be really difficult to see the differences. particularly between a coral that's on its way out the door and a coral that's fully dead. A pale SPS coral, it's really hard to tell if there's even tissue left on the skeleton. This is a Musa angulosa. This is another Caribbean species of coral. Most of my experience within the last 5 years really focuses on Caribbean corals. I do have significant Indo-Pacific coral experience as well, but you will notice a prevalence of those animals because those are what I have the most photos of. So this is Musa angulosa. This is a beautiful coral. You can see the tissue is very inflated. The coral, there's lots of different textures within it. It has beautiful coloration. This particular coral was a very heavy feeder, so we were feeding it every other day, pieces of scallop, krill, things like that. So behaviorally, we had set parameters that we knew around this specific coral. This is an example of that coral in decline. So it looks almost like two completely different corals at this point. The tissue has receded, it's pulled more tautly across the skeleton. You can see the skeleton peeking through. We had encroaching endolithic algae in the skeleton itself, so the skeleton, instead of looking white, actually looked kind of green. And we also had additional pests and things like that trying to colonize the skeleton of the coral. So that's kind of just to give you some parameters around what's a healthy coral and what's an unhealthy coral. When it comes to coral health, the best offense is a good defense. You really want to focus on quarantining your coral. I know we don't want to have another system set up in our homes or something that and with coral you need something fairly stable, so keeping it set up all the time is more ideal. But quarantine is your single best strategy. If you are investing hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of dollars into your reef system, don't let a pest in the door because it is 10 to 100 times harder to treat once it's on your reef. When we're looking at quarantine, this gives us an opportunity to look at the individual coral from a 360 view all the way around, so we can observe that coral, we can isolate any pests or disease before it hits our reef, and we can treat. It's a lot easier to treat one single colony and it's cheaper to treat one single colony than it is to treat a whole tank. So this is an example of another Caribbean coral. This is Montastria cavernosa. This came into our facility in 2020 as part of the Florida Reef Track Rescue Project. This coral we actually pulled right away before it went into the main grouping. We received feedback from the quarantining facility it came to us from that this coral was in a system that had presented with stony coral tissue loss disease. So we immediately separated it. We didn't want to get that into our system with our healthy coral. We weren't sure what was going on, the mechanisms that were utilized, so we wanted to get that out as quick as possible. This is an example of that same species that's healthy. So you can really see the difference in this coral where it's really shrunken in. You can see the skeleton coming through in both the polyp ridge as well as in the base, the cenosarc of those corallites. With a healthy version, we should be seeing polyp extension, strong feeding response. The tissue just looks fuller, juicier. It looks so much more colorful. And that was a really quick way for us to identify kind of who was healthy and who needed a lot of work coming in. You can see on the bottom, as I've kind of gone in here a little closer, that there's a receding tissue line. Tissue recession in coral is one of your best kind of early ideas of what's going wrong. Tissue recession can be due to a lot of different things, though. It's more of a symptom than a disease. We hear rapid tissue necrosis, slow tissue necrosis, but those are all symptoms. It's not going to tell you what is the specific disease that's harming your coral. You can treat for it, though. Usually when I see tissue recession, I'm going to be looking at my environment first. Did something change? I'm going to be looking at the individual animal. Is it presenting specific signs of certain diseases? And then I'm going to look at preventative treatments, things like doing antiseptic dips to help keep that margin from getting secondary infections, or potentially even scraping away the diseased margin and trying to cap it. And we'll talk about those a little bit later. This is another example of something you might see. This was a Pseudodiploria strigosa that came in and bleached within like the first 2 weeks we had it. It was like at 90% bleach of all the zooxanthellae. But in a situation like this, it showed no other signs of tissue recession, of deterioration. So we just fed it. We fed the crap out of it. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize when it comes to a bleached coral. They just have lost one of their feeding resources. So as long as you feed them consistently and you're seeing them eating, they can re-recruit that zooxanthellae. So when I have a coral that pales and I see no other signs of disease, I just focus on giving it the resources it needs to recover from that bleaching. This is something else that a lot of people see and they sometimes think are disease. This is an example on Aquaporus cervicornis of mesenterial filaments. So for those who don't know, mesenterial filaments are just a way for coral to eat and fight with one another. So basically they try and digest each other with these filaments that come out of their body. They're not necessarily a bad thing. If you see those filaments, it could be a sign of stress. It could be a sign of food on them or on their tissue that they're trying to consume. But they're not necessarily indicative of an issue, and you don't want to start picking around at them if that's the only thing you're seeing. So when it comes to disease, it's really important to identify your actual problem. There's really no silver bullet in the aquarium hobby that treats everything. So being able to kind of whittle down what your actual issue is going to give you a better arsenal of tools to treat that specific thing. A lot of times when it comes to disease progression, stress is the biggest issue. Same as with humans, right? When do we get sick? When we're at our most broken down, or at our most tired and worn out. The same goes for coral. Disease isn't spontaneous. It doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. Usually it's triggered by something. Once a coral is stressed out, then you have opportunistic colonizers. That could be pest species that the coral can't fight back against anymore. It could be different diseases. You can get one infection and then get a secondary infection on top of it, which is even worse. Usually those are bacterial infections. And that usually will end up leading to death of the colony. So when we're looking at disease, tissue margin is really important. So this is an example. This was Montaster cavernosa that we had some issues with across a series of about 2.5 years. So this is an example of kind of a slow tissue recession or necrosis. So this margin right here is actually a sign of a healing margin. You can see that it's a little plumper. It's starting to encase over top of the cyanoacrylate kind of Band-Aid that we used. And it looks like we're seeing additional budding and polyping along the edges. So when I'm looking at a coral that's recovering, this is something that makes me really happy to see. It means the coral's bouncing back. You can also see in the polyps around it, there's little budding happening in the base of the coral. Everything looks really nice and plump. The color looks really good. To me, this is like a huge win if I see a coral hitting this spot. But it can also decline. So you can see on this tissue margin that there's a little bit of white. White on a tissue margin is a really good indicator that coral tissue is receding fully. And that's kind of your preliminary sign that you need to start doing some rapid work. The only thing that happens fast with coral is death. And it's really important to move quickly if you want to save your reef. When we're looking at treatments, I usually try and break it up into 2 different types of treatment. So either it's going to be something antibiotic and microbial, or you're going to be looking at pest treatment. And that really just depends on what you're dealing with. Signs of disease, so this is going to be bacterial, viral, fungal infections, are going to be things like necrotic or receding tissue margins, consistent tissue loss across the coral colony as a whole. So you'll see a line of tissue potentially receding. You might see gaping or stretched tissue where you're just seeing skeleton underneath through. Paling of tissue across the entire coral, or even just spots of paling tissue, discoloration, production of mucus, loss of feeding response. A lot of people don't pay enough attention to the behavior of their coral. If your coral's behavior is changing, that's something to keep an eye on. It's happening for a reason, even if you don't know what it is. They are trying to tell you something is wrong. Listen to your coral. And then finally, jelly-like substances on coral are usually indicative of some sort of prokaryote or bacterial infection. I brought this up a little bit earlier. You'll hear a lot in the hobby where they talk about rapid tissue necrosis, rapid tissue loss. Rapid tissue loss is usually across like 24 hours or to a few days, and you'll lose an entire colony. It is really hard to stop RTN. There's some ways you can stop it utilizing fragging or amputation. You can also try to kind of help the coral with amino acids or things like that, but RTN is one of the hardest things to stop once it goes, and honestly your best bet is to just frag some of that coral off to save it as best you can. Slow tissue necrosis is the one you have the best chance of stopping. Slow tissue necrosis is gradual loss. It can take quite a bit of time, weeks to months, even years, like I said with that one coral. It can still eventually kill a colony if you don't figure out what the stressors are, but it's something you can fight, and I highly recommend trying to fight against it if you can. When it comes to antibiotics and antimicrobial treatments, over the counter, you have things like Reef primer that are potassium-based, Lugel's dips, which are iodine-based. Those are really beneficial as antiseptics. They can be helpful in mitigating secondary infection if you have to amputate a coral or frag it off. Usually doing some sort of iodine dip afterwards is going to help protect the tissue from getting a bacterial infection afterwards. That's also a really good tip for just fragging coral. Treat it like an open wound site, because it is an open wound site, and if you take care of it as an open wound site, you can help save that coral. As a zoo, I'm very fortunate that I have access to a vet. I can get prescribed medications. So we've used things like amoxicillin, oxalic acid, we've also used Cipro. Any of those can be utilized for battling those secondary infections as well, but they are usually a nuclear option and something you wouldn't want to use in your tank. It's going to completely knock out any beneficial bacteria, anything like that. So that's another reason why treating in quarantine or treating in med tanks is really important. You don't want to kill your reef. You don't want the medicine to be worse than the disease. If you have pests, you might see retracted polyps, you might see intermittent tissue damage, you might see eggs, usually a circle pattern or spiral pattern of eggs. You might see receding tissue, but it's more likely you're going to see mechanical damage from pests. Pest mitigation, dips like Revive, Coral RX, Bayer's, Interceptor, even freshwater dips, or mechanical removal, physically going in there and removing pests can be beneficial ways to mitigate pests. When you're treating for disease, you're treating for bacteria, you're trying to kill off that bacteria, it's usually a shorter treatment process. When you're treating for pests, you're treating the life cycle. Most of the time, the things that we use for treating pests only kill the adult life stages, but you still have cysts and eggs that are going to hatch. So when you're doing pest treatment, doing multiple treatments across multiple weeks is going to be significantly more beneficial in killing off the pest life cycle. So I highly recommend, when in quarantine, doing a Revive dip every week or a Coral RX dip every week, because then you're killing off those pests as they emerge as juveniles, and you can stop the life cycle before it gets established. Freshwater dips are something you can do. They do rely heavily on utilizing osmotic pressure. So your hope is that you basically autolyse the cells of the pest before you damage your coral. Freshwater dips are used primarily on like fish, but you can see some successes within coral. You just have to be very careful before you start playing with that, and you need to pull it if they're stressed. You also want to make sure your pH of your freshwater is as close as possible to your saltwater pH as possible. Here's some examples of damage you might see if you have some pests. I know it's a little hard to see on this projector. You might see the physical pest itself. You might see circle damage. If it's flatworms, things like that, you might see eggs. So here you might even see little crabs. So this is a gall crab. There's red bugs, those egg cases down at the base of a coral. Really getting into your coral, looking at a 360 view, knowing what your coral should look like and what you're seeing is really helpful in treating. Once you know what animal you're treating for, even if you don't know, even if you're like, there's just a crab here, I don't know what said crab is, but it's being crabby and being a problem. There's many resources online that can help you kind of get where you need to go for figuring out kind of what the issue is. This is an example of brown jelly disease. Brown jelly disease is actually a ciliate. Ciliates are found in your aquarium. They're just there. But when your coral starts to do poorly or an event occurs, they can build up in high numbers, and that can cause, and they can basically colonize wound sites and break down coral and kill off your coral a lot quicker than you'd think. Within hours to days, you can lose a coral to brown jelly. But if you can remove it, usually siphoning it off works really well, or if you can get the coral out of the system, you can help save that coral. Getting the ciliates off the coral is the first step. You just don't want to blast them off because then you throw them all around your reef aquarium. So again, another reason why treating in a medical tank or a quarantine system is really helpful. It helps prevent you from accidentally killing everybody else. And this is an example again of kind of that stony coral tissue loss. You can see that gaping tissue where it just looks like there's nothing underneath it. That was a new kind of style of disease that I had personally never dealt with. And I can't say that we won because we ended up losing this coral. But we were able to try new treatments and things like that that held it off a little bit and have worked successfully in other institutions. So when you're identifying cause in your tank, so trying to figure out what's going on with your coral, I go through a troubleshooting triangle. So I like to think really big and then keep going down until I get to the individual coral or the individual issue. So first, it starts off with changes to the system, the environment, that species, and then the animal itself. Because we forget sometimes that our coral are individual animals, and individual animals, just like us people, have different immune systems, and that can have an impact on how they behave and how they respond to treatment. So when we're looking at kind of what's changed recently, look at your equipment, look at chemicals that might have been used in or around your system. Did you switch a chemical? Did something happen, some sort of event occur that drastically, or maybe not as drastically as you thought, changed the environment? That can be a stressor, that can be something that can trigger. If you bring in a new animal, that new animal could have had pests or disease in the system. What are your parameters? What are your parameters at their most stable? Not chasing numbers, but what are you specifically working with? Coral is incredibly adaptive. We have a coral system where, I kid you not, the pH is 7.6, and those coral are doing great. I can't keep that pH above 7.6 because of CO2 accumulation, and anytime I get it up to 8, all the corals start throwing a hissy fit. So I've given up. I'm not chasing numbers on that system. The coral are happy where they're at. And I think that's really important too. If you have constant fluctuation, that's more detrimental to the coral than a stable environment that they can adapt to and do well in. So water chemistry can be a big component. Also, water chemistry changes throughout the day. So you might be having a problem that's appearing at night that you don't even realize that's happening. So try and do water testing, particularly around your pH, in the evening and see kind of what range of fluctuation is happening. Flow is really important. Has your pump gotten jammed up, or was it jammed up and suddenly it's blasting your coral now and it's shredding tissue? Lighting, are your lights starting to go out of their wave spectrum with fluorescence, with metal halides? Within like 8 months to a year, they can go out of spectrum. That can cause algal blooms, but that can also cause issues with the spectrum that the coral's used to. If you haven't invested in a PAR meter, try and get a hold of one. They can be really critical in identifying if you are utilizing the right ranges for your coral. Coral, you can blast them, but that can also cause issues if they're not prepared for it. Another thing is photo period. How long are those lights on? Is it adequate to provide the nutritional needs of the coral? Something that happens a lot is people rely exclusively on their lighting for nutritional needs of their coral, and then there's a coral decline because it wasn't a high enough PAR value. They aren't on long enough to support the nutritional needs of that coral's growth. So keep an eye on those things and any big changes in those things. So say you've gone through all of that, nothing's changed. All right, let's look at the individual species. Where is that coral found? What are its nutritional needs? Are there any species quirks? Like leathers, they all start to look like crap until they're about to shed their mucus. If you know that, then you know, okay, that's not really a disease, that's just my leather being a leather. Also, are all of the animals of that species or genus doing poorly in your system? So if you've got a mixed reef tank and all of your sarcophytans, all of your leathers are doing poorly, that could be a pest. Pests are usually relatively species specific. That could be the wrong parameters or the wrong lighting or the wrong flow for that particular group of animals. So looking at those things and really digging into why that specific group of corals isn't doing well can be really helpful to trying to diagnose what the issue is. Finally, we get to the individual. Say everything looks beautiful. except this one little blight in your tank. Look at the tissue condition. Was there fighting? Was one of your coral fighting with that coral and caused wounds to open up that are now getting colonized by bacteria? Is there issues with polyp behavior? Have you noticed that coral hasn't had a feeding response for a couple of weeks? And then the individual history of that coral. I had one coral that like every year in the same month bleached. I don't know why. I didn't have a light cycle set up that it could be a year. But that coral, for whatever reason at that time of the year, just hated me, bleached, and then I had to feed it every day, twice a day, for a very long time for it to re-recruit that zooxanthellate. If you have a particular coral that has a history of acting up, that can help prevent you from going nuclear on a situation that maybe is just this one coral being a pain. So tools of the trade. So when you're looking at treating for coral, obviously we have preventative dips, things like that, but there's also tools that you might need to utilize if the tissue recession is getting too strong. So dental tools, a lot of people don't realize they're like $7 on Amazon, and are one of my favorite tools for getting rid of encrusting algae or parasites or scraping away dying tissue. Coral cutters are really important. Dremels can be used for cutting away to healthy skin. A lot of times when you have tissue receding and you can't stop that recession, you need to cut into healthy tissue to save that coral. You can't just cut off the dead stuff, because the way disease works is it's still in that margin line. So you either need to fully scrape it away or cut it off. Usually about a half a centimeter to a centimeter into it is how much tissue margin you want to get to that healthy spot. And then if you're working with big, huge colonies or really like coral that have dense skeleton structures, you might need a bandsaw. And they offer a lot of opportunity for precision too, that you don't always get with the Dremels or the coral cutters. So I threw up there amputation versus fragging, and the reason I did that is because working in the zoo world, we actually utilize the term amputation more than we do fragging when dealing with our coral from the Caribbean specifically. Because if you're thinking about a medical procedure versus propagation, amputation starts to make a lot more sense. Usually too, if you're dealing with disease, you're probably cutting off a pretty good chunk of the coral trying to save it. So this was something that we use a lot when we're talking about intervention for medical purposes. It's going to be more of an amputation than fragging, which is usually that asexual reproduction where I'm just trying to get more colonies of my coral. These are some examples of those tools. Those dental tools, man, you can use the side of them. You can use them to pick stuff out of just the little septa. They work so well on a calcium carbonate skeleton because it's very similar to your teeth. Highly recommend. That's probably one of the single best investments when it comes to doing individual coral care I can recommend. And then the bone cutters, the aqua vitro bone cutters or coral cutters are really good. They work really well for those smaller coral skeletons. When it comes to repair of a coral, so there's a couple different ways that you can approach trying to prevent recession of tissue. One of those, which is a technique that we really use, is you scrape back the unhealthy tissue, again, past that healthy margin, and you use just cyanoacrylate glue, so just Reef glue, and you use it like a Band-Aid and cover that tissue margin, and that helps basically prevent colonizing of algae underneath the coral, as well as helping to just keep that encased and enclosed until the coral can start healing. Another thing or technique that we use is two-part epoxies. If you're getting endolithic algae within the skeleton of your coral, that can get under the tissue and irritate the tissue so it starts to lift up. If you smother that out by covering it with a two-part epoxy, you basically are preventing that algae from getting the light it needs to grow. So that can be a great way to help stop tissue recession. And then finally, utilizing iodine as antiseptic. If you're fragging, if you're treating, anytime you are doing damage to the tissue of a coral, utilize the antiseptic to clean the wound site. Do a dip, rinse and clean salt water, and then return to your system. Good wound management is critical to the survival of your animals and giving them the best shot that you need. Corals, like people, are kind of dirty and gross. They're hollow biomes. They got a lot of stuff going on in that tissue. The more help you can give them, the better. This is an example of that kind of super glue Band-Aid, if you will. So we had tissue recession on this coral. We completely scraped it using a toothbrush and those dental tools, got about a ½ centimeter of margin, and then capped it all off with that cyanoacrylate. And that worked incredibly well in slowing down that recession, and that's how we were able to start getting that really nice growth. Another thing too, right? If you have a coral that is not doing so hot, when we're sick, right, you might get chicken noodle soup or that family recipe of whatever soup your grandma made, and that helps you feel better. The same with coral. You want to provide as much supportive care as you can as they are trying to recover. So amino acids, additional nutritional supplements, really, really rich foods like oyster feast or phytoplanktons, anything that gives them an edge is going to be really critical in helping them to recover. Also, stable parameters. I cannot emphasize enough how important stable parameters are when it comes to coral and their recovery. If you are throwing multiple things that they have to account for at a coral, it's going to make recovery significantly harder than if all they have to manage is healing themselves. And then finally, time. Like I said earlier, the only thing coral does quickly is die. The recovery is significantly longer. So when your corals are recovering, give them time. It can take months, it can take years for them to bounce back. But if you give them the support that they need, they will. And then finally, something a lot of people don't want to talk about is calling it. Sometimes you have a coral you just can't save. No matter how meaningful it is to you, no matter how much you want to hold on to it, sometimes you caught it too late. So that Montasteria cavernosa I showed you earlier that had the signs of disease, we lost it within a month. We had access to antibiotics, we had access to all of the techniques we could have had that should have worked, and they didn't. And sometimes that happens too. We don't know enough about coral disease to understand fully the mechanisms at play to fully stop it. Even when it comes to people, medicine doesn't always work, right? You can try and try and try, but sometimes there's no saving. That like cervicornis on the left-hand side had some tissue in spots and places. Personally, anecdotally, if I've lost like 30 to 40% of the tissue on a coral, there's a really good chance without amputation, I'm not saving it. So making choices and decisions quickly is gonna really be the only way you can save these corals sometimes. And it stinks. Sometimes you just want to sit and wait and hope it gets better, and it won't. So moving quickly and decisively when it comes to coral health is incredibly important in making an actual difference. The only thing corals do fast is die is something that I want you all to leave here with. It's not my saying, it's something I've heard a lot from Carrie O'Neill, if you were here yesterday. She talked about coral spawning, but that's the thing that she always says too. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah. There can be so the question was, say you can't quarantine a coral because whatever's going on made it into your reef. Are there negative impacts to dosing with some of those antibacterials in your main system? The answer is yes. It's just hard to know what those issues are going to be. Your biggest thing that you're killing off, though, is your beneficial bacteria. And since that is such a foundational component of a lot of reef systems, it gets really tricky trying to balance kind of the medicine with the disease and what's worse for your tank as a whole. So in a situation where you can't fully remove the coral, you might just go in there and try and amputate that receding component. You can also try potentially to apply the iodine directly to the coral if you can kind of get in there and sort of kind of cordon it off. I know out in the reefs they've used like trash bags and things like that to try and get creative. I think that's the thing this hobby is the best at, is our creativity and our adaptability. But it is really tricky treating something once it is in your reef, which is why I highly recommend, if you have the ability to, build the thought of quarantine or hospital tanks into your design, right? Design rocks so you maybe can take them off if you've got a beautiful encrusting coral, things like that. Try and prepare for a time in which you might have issues in the beginning, and that can really help you if you do run into them. For a coral situation like that, I would feed the heck out of it. I would give it as much nutritional support as possible. I would really make sure my parameters weren't wiggling at all, and try and scrape away as much tissue as I could of a receding line, cap it off with glue, and hope for the best. Yeah, of course.
Talk about amino acids again. So are you actively dosing amino acids in systems like treatments for corals that are under stress or damage? Are you doing like an amino acid back?
Yeah, so the question was around amino acids, if we are constantly dosing amino acids, or when we are having coral that are showing signs of issues or distress, are we doing...
All right, folks, at 3 o'clock are the Aquashella
I'm going to give it a second.
Google main stage, 3 p.m. for the Aquashella Awards, the best of everything there was at the show. At 4 p.m. is the raffle for Aquashella. Be sure to get over there and get in for the raffle. Also at 4 p.m., Aqua EL is giving away one of their high-end tanks, I believe $400+ value over there. So get over there. If you haven't visited the booth, you just need to fill out a little slip to get entered for it. And you need to be there to win. So 4 o'clock at Aqua EL's booth, and then also the Aquashella raffle at 4 o'clock. If you haven't got your tickets yet, be sure to go get your tickets. Put them in. We'll be calling raffles promptly at 4 o'clock. And that will be the end of the show.
So talking about amino acids and how we utilize them for the health of our coral. So I do dose amino acids on our systems. We dose the recommended amount based on the manufacturer. I personally use AcroPower. I really like that, but there's a lot of other great aminos out there. In addition to that, if we do have coral that are showing signs of decline or health, we might do amino acid baths to just try and better support them. We can increase the concentration for short periods of time of those aminos, and we've seen some kind of tentatively anecdotal successes. So no clinical trials or anything like that, but it could be if you're in a situation where you need a Hail Mary, give it a shot. A lot of science has been found, or cures have been found because of accidents or somebody just giving it a shot. So there's opportunities if you have tried everything else and nothing is working and you think you're going to lose the coral anyway, it never hurts to try something new. Yeah? So I want to make sure I heard the question correctly. So if you have an ultra low nutrient tank and you're noticing your corals are shrinking up, how do you treat for those corals without negatively impacting the other corals, correct? Yeah, so you can target feed that specific individual coral. Target feeding usually is going to help reduce the impact of nutrients as a whole in your system. You can still do kind of water changes or doing some target siphoning if you want to make sure you don't have leftover kind of detritus that's going to build up nutrients. The biggest thing too, again, like those supplemental aminos aren't going to harm your animals in a low nutrient system and could be something that could put that coral over the edge. I've even found depending on the species, you can do like pellets and target like the individual polyps with pellets and let it sit on the tissue because sometimes the coral can still kind of break down and absorb using that mesenterial filaments even if the polyps themselves aren't having a feeding response. So I would really try and take as much of a targeted approach as possible, or if I had the option, remove that coral if I could. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming to my talk. I really appreciate you all, and hopefully you've learned a little bit about coral disease and how to treat it in your system. And I'm up here if anybody has any questions or just wants to chat coral health.